So my name is Kate Bosson. If you don't know me, I'm the founder at Brand Pollinators. And we started out as a marketing consultancy, but it turned into a lot more than that. So we wanted to work with impact-driven founders, and we discovered that everyone we talked to was just so inspiring, and we wanted to find ways to help. And so we've really built out Brand Pollinators to be a community to help impact-driven founders connect to each other and connect to resources that can help them scale. So we are so excited to be hosting a monthly community call with an expert. Our expert this month is Nick Budden. Welcome.
Hey, everybody. Thank you, Kate.
Yeah, thanks for being here. It's awesome to have Nick because he has some really good experience on the topic that we're discussing today. So Nick, he has really worked with strategic marketing and food innovation for some big brands, including Unilever and Yum brands, and Wells, which is Blue Bunny. So he's also been working independently as a consultant for the last few years. And in that time, he's worked with two of the largest salty snack brands, multi-billion-dollar companies. So very cool in helping with their innovation process. And then now he was just telling me about serving on the ReFed board. So they're awarding grants to organizations that are fighting food waste. So Nick has been working with food brands for a long time and has some great experience that I'm excited to hear from him.
Yeah, thanks so much for the intro, Kate. So quite a bit of experience working with bigger brands, also starting to move a bit into the more early stage brands, founder-led brand space. I've done a few consulting engagements with brands as small as $1 million in sales. The biggest hit that I've had so far was about a $50 million brand that felt like a really nice partnership and lasted for about 6 months to help them stand up their innovation pipe and process. But yeah, really brands of all sizes, even though my bias is toward, bigger brands, and that's where I got really the foundation of my experience.
Yeah, so today we're talking about product market fit specifically. So, I mean, honestly, I didn't know a ton about this term product market fit. And it seems like basically you have to have product market fit if your product is going to be successful. Okay, so what are like some of those key pillars that would make a product market fit?
Yeah, so this is just a really fun quote that comes to mind. Mark Andreessen, he was this longtime Silicon Valley investor. He's a co-founder of Netscape and Mosaic, and he's been in the Silicon Valley space and helping at least tech-driven brands, find product market fit. He was actually the one who often gets credit for coining the phrase. I think there's a few other people who do too. But he's got a quote that I really like that's sticky, and it says, and he said that product market fit means being in a good market with a product that can satisfy that market. Incredibly simplistic definition. But to me, I think there's a few key pillars you can pull out of that. So the first is being in a large and growing addressable market. So you could have the best product in the world, but if you're not actually in a market that's big or growing, it doesn't really matter because you're going to fall on deaf ears. So the first one is just being in a large and growing addressable market. The second one is having a really clear consumer target. So, knowing who your ideal client is, knowing exactly who that consumer target is really, really important. The third is understanding those consumers' wants and needs. So once you have a ton of empathy for your consumer and you understand what those unmet wants and needs could be, it's all about understanding how to better satisfy those than the competition. And so to me, those are kind of the three big ones. But the fourth is all about creating a concept that addresses those wants and needs. And when I say a concept, to me, a concept is so much more than just a physical product. It includes all of the 7 Ps. There's 4 Ps, 6 Ps, 7 Ps. I like 7 Ps. So that includes product proposition, price, promotion, packaging, place, and I would add the 7th of purpose. I'm a really big advocate of purpose-driven brands. But anyway, to me, a concept is the idea in its entirety, and a product is a physical manifestation of that idea. So when you hear things like product market fit, it's all about, do you have a large and growing addressable market? Do you have a consumer target? Do you understand those wants and needs of that target? And then you have a concept and a product that actually delivers on that.
Yeah. Okay. That totally makes sense. And, it's funny because I've given a lot of presentations about marketing, and a lot of times in the intro to marketing, I talk about how marketing is just bringing a product to market. And it's like all the stuff that goes along with that. And so the product market fit is really like making sure that that market is the right place and making sure that the product is the right thing.
Yeah, it's such an easy thing in words, but it's so hard in practice. And I think everyone on the phone
Yeah.
can probably relate to that. But that's it. That's product market fit in a nutshell. Yeah.
So how would people know, like, if they have a big addressable market, like you said, like, how do you know if that's like, that's going to be a good market for you?
Yeah, I think when you look to like different pitch decks and different, founder presentations, especially when they're trying to get investment for the first time, there's often drastically different ideas of the size of the market. But obviously, a lot of the different things you can look at is, how big is the category today? Does it seem to be growing? Does it seem to be declining? I typically like 3 or 5 year CAGRs because that just zooms out a little bit from the current moment in time and gives a little bit of sense of where things are heading long term. But just starting with some of that category sizing is always a really nice place to start. But I'm sure I'll get into this a bit further on down in the presentation. But as we talk about things like category sizing, I think it's really important that we remember that categories are something that marketers create and consumers often ignore. The boundaries of a category are often incredibly blurry, and people often just have needs that they want met. If they don't necessarily want chips, they might want something crunchy or something salty or something fun or something just to break the boredom. And when you think about things in a little bit more of an expansive way like that, and you think about product substitutes that can meet all of those different needs, it's obviously a much bigger conversation, and it really opens the door to meaningful innovation. So yeah, hopefully that gets at a little bit of product sizing and looking at different sizes of markets. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, that's a good point that like customers aren't always like paying attention to what those categories are. So how would you learn more about what those specific customers are that how would you understand more about what it is that they're looking for in a new product?
Yeah, I mean, the pithy answer is just to talk to them, right? There's definitely formal ways to do it. You can do things like in-depth interviews and focus groups. You can get your statistically significant surveys. Anybody who's taken a stats class knows you got to get to a certain number. Those are the really formal ways to do it. But there's a ton of informal ways to do it too. I mean, I think a lot of folks will probably be, tabling at things like a farmer's market or a trade show. If you're not going to XOS, you should probably check out XOS. But that's a good opportunity to, get products in people's hands and ideally in their mouths so they taste it, and then just ask them informally, what do you think? What was good? What did you like? What didn't you like? And just keep probing and priming them and trying to understand, all of the different things that they like a product or all the things that could still be improved. So I think the scrappiest way is, doing that, just talking to people. You can go even scrappier than, sampling in person and just look at social media and ratings and reviews. I think a really good place to start is actually to look at your competitors' social media presence and ratings and reviews and see where there are really unmet needs and
Mm-hmm.
where their products fall short. I think that's a really nice, easy way to start, but just always keep in mind that people are a little bit more savage on social media and a little bit more people pleasing in person. It's definitely, you definitely have to take everything with a grain of salt and think through, how you're asking the questions and make sure you're considering bias as people are answering too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's such a good way of putting it. Like, people are definitely going to be a lot more harsh when they're not talking to you in person. But it may be more truthful because, they're not people pleasing at the same time. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of ways to get that information, but there's so many variables there when the way you ask the questions and the way that the surveys worded and how you're going to convince people to actually participate, and if you have a statistically significant sample size. Statistics was not my strong suit.
I mean, some of it's like very common sense, right? Like, you don't want to ask somebody, why do you love this product? I mean, you don't want to lead people.
Right.
But certainly like think through your methodology and how people might show up in those rooms. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a fine balance, I think, for getting the right questions, because you really want to get truthful answers, and you're not like, and sometimes it's nice to get like, you can do leading questions in order to get like testimonials or things like that. But if you're if you're actually looking for real information that's going to solve somebody's problem, you really want a truthful answer.
Yeah, I mean, I still love blind taste tests. I think that's one of the best ways to do it. If you can start a conversation without letting anyone know what product or what brand you work on or who you represent, that's one of the best ways to get impartial responses from folks. So blind it when you can.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Okay, so I know I'm asking lots of questions and Nick is already like spouting out all kinds of information here, but if you have a specific question, feel free to chime in, come off mute, or jump in the chat and leave a little note for us in the chat, and we'll try to pay attention there so we can make sure that you get your questions answered. So another question that I had is, does it help or hurt if there's already a competitor with a similar product in the marketplace? Because I know you mentioned earlier looking at their reviews and kind of seeing what other people are sort of falling short on.
It ultimately depends, right? You're going to hear that from me a lot today, probably, but it really does depend. Are your target consumers satisfied with their existing options? Is the first question you should be asking. Because there could be the biggest incumbent in the world, but if they're leaving so many compromises on the table, there's still a market there to be addressed. So really dig into satisfaction and try to get a sense of, is it good enough? Is it meeting their needs, or is there, still a massive white space for you to explore? There's actually one book on this that I really like, The Category Pirates. They're like they take themselves incredibly not seriously at all. But they talk about these unspoken compromises that people have to make when they shop in a specific category. And I think it's a really good way to think about it. So a couple of brands come to mind. The first one is actually, well, I'm not going to spoil the brand quite yet. So let's talk about chocolate bars and protein bars for a second. Typically, you either have to choose something that either tastes great or is great for you. So when a product tastes really good, obviously you're leaning toward chocolate bars. If you want something that's great for you, you're settling for these protein bars that are good enough and they're chalky and the texture might suck and the flavor might suck, but it feels good for your macros, right? You're either totally functional or totally bad taste. So that's kind of the unspoken compromise within the chocolate bars and protein bars space. Then along came this brand called Midday Squares, and they're completely built on eliminating that compromise for people. So their consumer target is somebody who wants both big taste and big nutrition. And I think it's just fascinating how much Midday Squares has been able to grow in such a short order by solving that one very specific category compromise. Obviously, there's plenty of people who are content with one side or the other. Hershey's caters to taste, another really big brand. Glanbia is another one, caters to nutrition. That obviously a really big category that they've built around sports nutrition and sports bars. But none of those three brands are necessarily better than the other. They're just going after a different product that satisfies a different set of wants and needs and a different target. So that's why I go back to that first definition and those original pillars. You got to know who you're going after before you can find a product that actually, satisfies those needs.
Yeah, I was thinking the you want a large addressable market, but there's also this factor of niching too, where you want to meet a need that's not being met somewhere. And so just because, women or people who eat chocolate or, these are huge categories of people, but they're not necessarily just because you create something for them doesn't mean that it's going to fit exactly what they're looking for. So it needs to be more niche, but still a large addressable market.
For sure. Absolutely. And there are countless founder stories that started with one very specific, thing that they wanted that they couldn't get for whatever reason. They might have a nut allergy and they found that all the chocolate bars out there contain some sort of trace amount of nuts. And so they couldn't have that. And so there was an entire movement around, low allergen products that has kind of followed this. But I think there's no shortage of founders who have found one specific thing where they felt like they as an individual were being, underserved. And as a result, they found countless other people who were also being underserved. And suddenly there was a product there and a market there, and they were off to the races.
And do you think a lot of that, it feels to me like a lot of that comes from combining and sort of overlapping things that either aren't working separately or things that can just work better together or are more common together? Like you said, the healthy snack that's also tasting good. I mean, that's really common, but things where you're kind of combining, and I think the category pirates probably get into that as well too.
They do. Their big focus is on like creating new categories, and so they have a whole book around category creation. So that's their bias and where they're leaning, right? They're going to lean you toward creating a truly disruptive product in a category that doesn't exist today. You don't necessarily have to do that. You can also take an existing category that's really big and disrupt it in a meaningful way with some sort of new insight. That's also a totally valid way to grow your brand. And also countless brand stories of founders who have done the same thing, where they felt like they were being underserved in one particular area. So one that comes to mind is actually Virgin Airlines. So great book, Richard Branson, Losing My Virginity, I think is what it's called. Super punchy title, but it's a really good example of that. And he just talked about how British Airways was consistently underserving most people, and it was a really stuffy experience, and it wasn't a fun experience to travel, and he wanted to bring that back to people. And so he created Virgin Airlines, and obviously it's a household name now. They've worked for a number of reasons, but the starting point was, I just want a flight experience that's actually fun. So yeah, I mean, they disrupted an existing category as an existing, product. They just did it better.
So I think one of the big questions people usually have when they're like introducing a new product is, how long until will it take to know if it's actually gaining traction, and if it's meeting that market fit?
Yeah, I think there's a few indications you can get really early. Velocity is going to be true pretty much regardless of when the product's out there. So velocity is the go-to measure that most retailers will use in their set. They look at things like units per store per week selling. But basically, it just gets at how quickly is your item moving off of the shelf compared to the items around it. So good enough. Performance is always relative, and long enough is really subjective because of that. One way I like to think about it is by looking at the typical purchase cycle for a product. So a couple examples might help here. If, for example, I can imagine that you buy milk and bread much more frequently than you buy olive oil and salt. So you can make a call on categories like milk and bread, potentially within a matter of a couple of weeks. If somebody's going out, they see the product, they try the product, they repurchase the product, you can already start to see an uptick in product market fit pretty quickly if there's already a base of awareness. Compared to something like olive oil and salt, if you're only purchasing it a couple of times a year, it's going to take a little bit longer to see whether that actually has staying power and whether people are actually loving it, repeat purchasing it, talking to other people about it. It depends on the category. So that's a specific product or category, I suppose. But if you're making the call on whether or not your brand is a good fit, that's a totally different conversation, and probably a much bigger conversation, because then you need to start looking at things like, how many people are aware of my brand and where is my brand distributed? You can get a really early sense of it, back to the farmer's market or trade show example. If you're just pulling people over to your booth like a magnet, or are they just gliding past you, it's probably pretty good early indication. Certainly not a perfect measure, but it's a hint. And obviously word of mouth is like the biggest thing within product market fit. So you're trying to get at word of mouth in whatever way you can. And I think NPS, Net Promoter Score, is a really good way to do it. I can get into the nuances of that if you'd like, or I can leave that alone. It's a pretty simple research methodology, but ultimately what you're trying to understand is, do you have positive word of mouth for your product? Are people just raving about it? They love it so much that they have to go tell their best friend and everybody in their family, this is the greatest thing ever, you need to try it, and I'm going to buy it for you. Like, is it that extreme of intensity in a positive way? Or is it something where, you kind of have to like really force people to try the product, and like you're constantly selling. And I think the more selling that needs to be done, it's probably an indicator that, you might actually have a little bit of work to be done on product market fit, because when it's working, it really works, and your word of mouth just takes off. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So the NPS score, I mean, we don't have to get too far into that, but one thing I was curious about is I've seen usually it's like, how likely are you to recommend this product? But then I've also seen like, how upset would you be if you could no longer get this product? I mean, do you have any thoughts on like, do you need one or both, or is either one better? Or
I think they're getting at the same thing. So I think either methodology works, but just keep in mind, how people show up to surveys, and obviously like all the bias, all the structure, all the priming that I kind of mentioned and alluded to earlier. You got to be careful about how you ask the question. If you ask somebody, how upset are you going to be if this product goes away? And then people are up in arms, like that's an even more intense way of asking NPS. And I think it sets an even higher bar compared to if you say, by the way, I'm from this brand, and I really hope you like this brand. How likely are you to recommend this to a friend from 0 to 10? The framing is like so much of what the score is going to indicate. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Feel free to let us know in the chat if you have done surveys like this before, or like specifically, are you capturing a NPS score on your products? Because I'm curious to see how that's working for people, or if you have like a specific question about getting those survey results from customers, because I think that's like a super important part of understanding that product market fit and like what's working and what's not working.
Yeah, I think just one more thought on NPS, and then we can probably move on if folks are bored with this methodology. But basically, there's a rule of thumb that you want an NPS of at least 40%. I just want to make sure everybody in the room knows, like, that's a starting benchmark, and there's going to be different benchmarks for each category. It's super contextual, and obviously, like, you want to make sure that you're outperforming the folks who are the closest to you in your relative set. But it's really hard to get at that data sometimes. And so I think of NPS as like a starting point, gives you a sense of how satisfied people are with your product. And then if you can move the needle on NPS using your same methodology, that's a sign that you're iterating and you're making the product better, and it's heading in the right direction rather than the wrong direction. So I see NPS as a starting point, and just keep in mind that it's always super relative.
And you think that that would help you determine like whether it was like kind of more the nuances of what wasn't working or what was working? So is it something to do with the messaging, or is it where the product is sold, or is it some kind of attribute or the price? Like, could you glean that information that way as well, or is there other formats you'd recommend?
Yeah, so a bunch of thoughts here. First is, like, if you're doing a survey related to NPS, that follow-up question might be more important than the actual measure of NPS, which is, things like, what can we do better? Or why are you extremely satisfied? Why are you not satisfied? The why behind it is probably more insightful than, oh, it spat out a 38% and we want to be at a 42. That's a little bit more arbitrary. But digging into the why is where the insight really lies. So talking to products specifically, there's a lot of different ways you can measure the success of a product. I've mentioned a few already. So NPS is like the closest thing to a gold standard, I think. Sensory testing is good. That gets a little bit more nuanced, and you usually want someone who has a little bit of a science background actually conducting this sort of thing, but it's looking at things like, what is the texture of the product? You'll see things used like jar scores, which is just about right. So you could ask something like, is this product, let's talk about an ice cream cone for a second. Like, is it too creamy? Is it not creamy enough? Is it just creamy enough? Like, you want to fall in the middle band generally when you ask any of these questions. Same with like crispiness or crunchiness. You can get a texture, you can get a flavors, you can test a lot of different things with a just about right score. But all of this only matters if it's truly with your consumer. So sensory testing is one of them. I like blind taste tests, especially if there's any sort of competitive element to it. Sometimes you'll hear this called a central location test. So you actually bring people to a central location where they'll try, both your product and your competitive product, and they'll basically give an indication of which they prefer. That's another really good place to start. Ratings and reviews, another good example that's a little more scrappy and more available to folks, especially when they're early on in their journey and more direct to consumer. So that's a bit related to products. I think for things like messaging, bigger companies often do things like aided and unaided recall of a given ad, and that could be a TV commercial, a 30-second YouTube ad, digital banner. There's a ton of different ways to test this out, but ultimately they're getting at, do you remember the ad that we showed you a week ago, 2 weeks ago? Did it stick, and did you retain it? And what exactly did you take out from that ad? So that's a little bit more around awareness. If you have panel data, this is probably a little bit later on in your journey, but you can look at things like trial rate for your product compared to the trial rate for competitors' product, and same with repeat purchase rate. I really like repeat rate if you have the data, because that's one of the closest things that's linked to taste. If people actually go out there, they try the product, they like the product, and then they're ultimately coming back to repeat and buy again, that can be a really compelling metric in a lot of your different retail presentations to say, okay, the incumbent is this, but we're repeating at a rate that's almost 2x the incumbent. So we should have more space on the shelf. You can actually open up the conversation that way. In a digital world, if you're looking at things that are more direct to consumer, you can certainly look at things like conversion rate, add to basket rate, click-through rate. getting into more of those digital marketing KPIs.
Yeah,
but ultimately, yeah.
Somebody had asked about if you don't have a direct competitor, so those would probably be good for that as well.
For sure. It's a little bit of word salad, but I think honestly, all the different measures ultimately trying to get at, if someone sees your value proposition, do they see enough value to actually give it a try? Because if they do, you're over the trial hurdle. And at that point, if they've tried it and they like it and they come back, then it's all about repeat and making sure that the product is delivering enough on expectations to bring them back in.
Yeah, that's tricky. Yeah. So Geetha asked, what if you have a direct competitor, but your product, if you don't have a direct competitor, but your product is a new item in an existing category?
You might have to unpack that one a little bit for me. So it sounds like there's an existing category, but there's not a direct competitor. So why wouldn't you just benchmark against the category? I might not be following fully.
Yeah. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Nick. I think you and I have talked about this before. So I have the tempeh. There is no tempeh entrees in the frozen entree space at this point. So I don't have a direct competitor. My competitor is in the category, right? So when you talk to people, they're like, yeah, but I don't have an apples to apples comparison. So I'm unique in the sense that there is absolutely no tempeh entrees in the market anywhere in the US. But I do fit into the frozen, vegan food category, frozen food category, like purple carrots and forks and knives and any of those people, right? So basically what I decided to do is I did the survey like, you had suggested, we did all the surveys, but I still feel like that's not enough for me to just go to stores directly. So I've decided to do a meal plan and catering and including all those items so I can get even more feedback and get a word of mouth with the product. So we find that with our meal plans, every order that we get, that at least one item is the tempeh item that they're ordering, which helps because I can now track the data to see how many times they're buying the same item over and over again on a weekly basis. And it's pretty consistent. So I'm going to keep collecting that data, but I'm kind of holding off on going to the markets, like the stores at this point, till I feel comfortable that there is enough people who have had exposure to the product, because I don't want to put it in the store and having it just sit there or spend a lot of money on marketing and promotion. I'm trying to go the slower road. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so two thoughts on where to start. I think the first is if there's a global benchmark, that can give you a hint of the total addressable market. So theoretically, let's say, I don't know these numbers, you'll know your category much better than I will. But if tempeh is 5% of plant-based in, I don't know, making it up, India, for example, if it's 5% of the market in India, then theoretically you could start to expect, or even using that as a very, very early assumption, you could say, if we can get to 5% of the US market, of the US plant-based market, it could be worth X. That might be one approach. Obviously, you want to massage this with different assumptions, right? So that's one way in, just looking at your total addressable market. The other piece of it is looking at adjacent SKUs. So even if it's not like a perfect one-to-one comparison for you, what are other plant-based items that are similar? How are they performing next to you? Ideally, if it's in retail set, you could say within Kroger's retail set, within their deli section, how is this performing compared to other items in the space? Again, you'll know your category and your product a lot better than I will. But if you can actually look at the items surrounding it, even if it's not a perfect one-to-one, that'll help with some of the retailer logic.
But if those companies are private, how do you get that metrics on, to compare how my product might do in that category?
Yeah, that's fair. I think a really straightforward answer is to ask your buyer, like, what are the velocity targets that you have for your set? You'd be surprised how often you can get a very direct answer from your buyer on that. Sometimes it will give you a clear range as like the category average within their set. Sometimes they'll say, this is the leader and we'd love to see you start moving toward the leader. But you'll usually get a pretty blunt answer, especially if you press a little bit.
Yeah,
thanks, Nick. Thank you.
That's great. Yeah, and it reminds me too, I think, Nick, I've heard you talk about the jobs to be done theory before too, but like, this is a scenario that reminded me of it, because it's like, if the job to be done is I'm a vegan and I want like a healthy, quick microwave, like a frozen meal, then what are the solutions that exist out there? And so I don't know if you're featuring tempeh as like your hero ingredient, or if you're just focused on the vegan meal in itself. But I think that's kind of the idea, is that like it's serving a purpose. It's like doing its job, so it's fulfilling its job for someone.
100%, completely agree with what Kate just said. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we did try to go the very simplistic way of just doing a tempeh cake, and then you would have to buy it and cook it in many ways. So we tried both in our surveys, and we found that 99% of the people wanted the convenience of a ready to eat. So we had to switch our strategy, go to market strategy, and say, this is what we want, because very few people actually wanted to just buy the tempeh and cook it themselves.
Yeah, that's great. It's awesome that you've been able to get that much insight from the things that you've tried. That's so cool. And it's working, right? So someone else has asked, when you launch, how often would you recommend running surveys to measure your NPS?
It's a good question. Obviously, you would want to make sure that you're actually making improvements to the product before running the survey. I would think, like, you want to make sure that you're actually changing a variable rather than just measuring to measure. It's going to depend how often you change things. So ballpark, I don't know, making this up a little bit, but if you change the product and it's continuously iterated and you're saying, we just want to keep finding what product market fit is, we have minimum viable product, but we want to keep shifting toward finding product market fit. If it's just like an always on thing, I don't think you would need to do it more than every quarter. Even that's probably a bit aggressive. Probably every 6 months is more realistic. If there's actually no change to the market, then I wouldn't see any major reason to measure unless there's, some sort of major competitive shift happening. But yeah, I think, test as needed, and as product develops, as you go from 1.0 to 1.1 to 1.2, those are the nice natural moments to look.
Or what about if you're doing like a line extension, or like adding flavor, new flavor or something like that?
Okay, so that's a different question, I think. So if an existing product is doing well and you're looking for a line extension, how much research is that kind of what you're getting at? Okay, so it really depends. Again, sorry for the it depends. But when I think about research, I often think that it sits opposite of risk. So if there's a lot of value at risk in what you're doing, you want to do a lot of research to mitigate that risk. And if there's not as much value at risk, you probably don't need as much. So as an example, if you're considering changing something like the original Klondike bar or Hellmann's 30 ounce, these things that make up like half of the brand's sales, you really can't afford to get it wrong. So you're going to need to do a lot of research. On the other hand, if you have a product line that's like starting to get established a bit, there isn't as much value at risk, you probably can get by with a little bit scrappier research, or ultimately doing a little bit less research. So I like value at risk as a starting point. Beyond that, beyond the value of the current product sales, there's certainly other potential costs to keep in mind. Things like R&D costs, inventory costs, advertising and promotion costs, slotting costs, any sort of cost that goes into the development work is a meaningful cost. And to me, that's further another thing to look at as it relates to value at risk. There's also certainly some risk to brand equity, but I think a lot of early stage brands overvalue this. I think bigger brands certainly need to be really concerned with this, because a really public mistake can have really meaningful impact to your brand. But if only 1% of the market that you're going after knows about you, how much are you really risking by trying something new, getting it wrong, and making the change? So I think there's a little bit more license to iterate, to try things out, to prototype and test your way there when you're in early stage than when you were more established brand. But yeah, again, I think it really depends on how much value is at risk, and you should invest in research accordingly. One of the thought here, I think it also depends how far you're trying to stretch your brand. So when people say brand extension, that could be a line extension. You could have a sparkling water and you have 5 flavors and you're going after flavor number 6. You probably have a pretty good sense of how that market performs, and you probably don't need a ton more research going from SKU 5 to 6 than you did from 0 to 1. Similarly, you should also think about, like, if you're entering a new category, that's a much more meaningful swing. You want to make sure that your brand is actually offering something unique and meaningful to the category that you're entering. And so probably significant research needed again there. I would almost look at a category extension like you're starting from scratch. You're certainly not always. There are some categories that are really close in, but you have to make sure that your brand attributes offer something that isn't currently being provided by incumbent brands when you go into a new category. So it depends. How much value is at risk? How far are you stretching the brand? Those are some big questions you should be thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then when you're early stage like that, I mean, if you're iterating a lot and you're wanting to test and take those surveys a lot, then it seems like you would be running the risk of asking the same people, like the same survey questions multiple times. I don't know if that would be good or bad, but it seems like that would be likely if you have a small brand and you're kind of like still like learning who your market is.
Yeah, that's a really good thought. You don't want to obviously saturate the same people, and you don't want to ask, I don't know, my friend Mike 6 times in a row. Like that's going to be a lot. And they'll probably be more likely to disengage with the survey if you do end up using the same sample. So do keep that in mind too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and we had another question about the extension. So do you advise starting a number of different flavors? So if a client wants to launch a brand, do they start with 3 or 5, or is it like you would go sequentially?
Yeah, this one, it's a great question. It's a question I get all the time. There's a lot of different ways to approach it. So probably the most academic way is to do a turf study. I really like these. I'm a total geek. I feel like I have to push my glasses up when I say this. But what a turf study does is it looks at the total unduplicated reach and frequency of a product line, and it uses statistical analysis. So this is like hardcore quantitative approach. They're super fun and really eye-opening. But basically what they look at is if you're launching a 3 SKU lineup, you'll cover this percentage of the market. So making this up, if you're in a baked product, you'll probably want like a chocolate chip, which might reach 25% of the market. You might want like a peanut butter, which could reach another 20% that wouldn't otherwise be addressed by the chocolate as your first SKU. And then, I don't know, maybe something fruity like a blueberry, like that could get you another 15. So 25 plus 20 plus 15, hopefully somebody can do quick math, but it reaches that amount of the market. That gives you a starting point to say, okay, maybe a 3 SKU lineup is enough. Maybe I'm reaching enough of the market for me, or maybe we should go after, maybe we should go after SKU number 4, SKU number 5 to start grinding out those slivers of the market. At a certain point, you're going to tail off, and at a certain point, it's not going to make sense for the operational complexity of launching additional SKUs. So there's like an actual, quantitative, mathematical reason to stop innovating and to stop developing products. But certainly not everyone is going to have the budget to do a turf study. There are scrappy ways to do it. I should say that. Like there are research vendors out there who can do this for under 10K. So if you're looking to do something like this, it can be done if you have some budget available. If you're not looking to do something as heavy as a turf study and you're looking a little bit more scrappy, talking to your buyer is a good place to start. Sometimes they just want a full door, or they want a full portion of the shelf set. Like we'll give you 3 SKUs because that's what packs out nicely. It can be that simple. It can be as intense as a turf study. There's a lot of different reasons and rationales in between. I think competitive landscaping is another really good exercise to do here. So going back to the example of a sparkling water, it seems like a lot of other players have a lot of different options. And so novelty seems to be something that's working in the category. You can usually get pretty good hints from that. But ultimately, it's a business decision between complexity and reach. How much operational complexity is worth the reach of the people that you're trying to reach? Yeah, hopefully that's as clear as I can be in a very it depends sort of question.
Well, that makes me think like maybe this is a stupid question, but like if you're talking about the buyer wants to have a certain amount of space on the shelf, or maybe 3 SKUs looks good together, whatever. Well, like if you had more flavors, then are you going to get more space on the shelf?
Maybe. It's not always the case.
Right.
Sometimes you'll develop products that will be amazing on the bench and everyone will be really excited about putting them in front of a retailer, and the retailer might just take a hard line and say, you only have the velocities to justify 3 SKUs. Which 3 do you want? I've definitely had those conversations, especially on a bigger brand. There's also times where you think you'll get 3 and you end up with 2, and you're just banging your head against the wall because you did all the research to get the perfect 3 SKU lineup, and suddenly you're left with 2 because that's what the retailer awarded you. Those are some of the practical realities of what we do. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we've got a couple more questions. So Lars has to leave by Lars. What is the best advice for a business that owns baked goods stores and is interested in getting into retail? Oh, okay. So this is kind of a different question, but if you're moving from one channel to another, maybe that's the way to frame it.
Maybe I didn't totally follow the question. So is it just looking for validating product market fit when you make that move? Is that what they're getting at?
Yeah, from going from the actual brick and mortar to getting into other retailers, it sounds like.
So two approaches. I think one, you can start with your existing consumer base and try to understand what unique needs that they would have in that channel. So if you have it was going from a physical bakery to a retail, or the other way?
Did you want to chime in with your question? I'm not sure. Oh, it looks like she's frozen.
No. Well, I guess I'll make an assumption. So I guess it doesn't really matter that much. So if you're going from a physical bakery to retail, you obviously have your base of existing physical bakery customers that you can talk to, and you could just do some very simple surveys like, what would you expect from something that's as a kit, or something that's a solution that you could buy in your local Whole Foods? You can start to pick their brains about what their specific needs are when a product shows up in that way, in that channel. So just lean on your existing loyal consumers to start doing some of that research. The other side of it is you have a totally different consumer set of people who would never walk into the bakery that will now run into you in the retail aisle. So it would also help to also conduct research on the folks who, don't shop that specific bakery, and to understand what their specific needs are, what unmet opportunities there are, where there is white space in the retail category that you can meet uniquely as a brand that has a retail presence, that has a bakery presence. For example, you might be able to really lean into the attributes of something like freshness that something like an Entenmann's can't do. So there's different benefits and attributes that you can really highlight as a brand when you're making one of these moves. Just be true of where you started and try to understand where the gaps are and try to thread the needle. That's the challenge.
So speaking of being true to where you started, there was one other question that we wanted to cover today, and I want to make sure we get back to it, but it is the concept of product purpose fit.
Yeah, so this is a new idea that I'm playing with. I feel like a lot of the founders that I talk to see their business as a way to give back to the world, and I completely admire and share that point of view. But if you identify with what I just said, you should really take a moment to think about your mission through the eyes of your consumer, because every brand means something very specific to those people. And if I just start saying, a number of different brands, if I say Nike versus Adidas, you have two immediately different thoughts on Nike and Adidas and how they might have a different social mission attached to them. So it's just important to take a humility check for a moment, zoom out, even though this is your baby and this is your opportunity to make a mark in the world. And that's incredible. And I want more brands to do that. You have to have the honesty check with yourself and with the consumers who actually use your brand. So that's kind of the first point. A couple examples might help here. So Lifebuoy is a brand that I think is really beautiful. It's about $1 billion brand. It's a soap brand, and it's mostly sold in developing countries. And they run the world's largest hand washing program. So their social mission is to help more kids reach their 5th birthday. And the way that they do that is by encouraging kids to wash their hands at 5 clear occasions to avoid preventable diseases. And so there's a clear product purpose fit, right? More kids wash their hands, less kids get preventable diseases, more kids reach their 5th birthday. And as the market share leader in soap in India, Lifebuoy grows as a consequence of running their hand washing program. It's a fully integrated business model. There's a functional benefit that's totally tied to what you're doing as the social work. Another example here is Hellmann's. So Hellmann's is a mayonnaise that's all about fighting food waste. And they just recently found their way to fighting food waste. So it's a little bit of a development as a brand. They found their way to the space. But when you think Hellmann's mayonnaise, fighting food waste, it feels a little more disjointed until you make the connection that people make leftovers. They make things like Thanksgiving turkey sandwiches. And they use Hellmann's for that, and it adds more taste. So it goes back to brand attributes, and there's a lot of good things. So the people who make leftovers with Hellmann's, the more people who do that, the less food waste it will have, and the more mayonnaise gets sold. So it's still fully integrated, but it's a little bit more of a conceptual stretch. Okay, last one. I won't name the name for this one. It's a really early stage brand. I love what they're doing, but you'll find that it's a little bit more of a stretch. So they're an olive oil brand. They're all about peace in the Middle East. Important mission, incredibly important mission. And they actually source olives from both sides of a war-torn country. So that's incredible, right? But the logic is just a little bit too disjointed. It goes from olive oil to olives to extending an olive branch. And so it just feels a little bit more conceptually far away. And as much as I love the brand and I love their mission, it's just too far removed to be an olive oil. It's too far removed to be like this conceptual quick get. So I'd argue they still have some positioning work to do to make sure that it's really concrete and it's really tangible and they're really integrated. So for me, product purpose fit is all about creating these like really concrete, physical, functional connections between your product and the social good that you're hoping to do with it. And to me, that ultimately creates the strongest mental associations, and those make the most tightly interconnected social businesses. So I would just encourage people, again, like do the research, talk to people, take yourself out of the brand for a moment, understand what role your brand plays in people's lives, and then try to create a concrete physical connection with the product, and you'll have a tighter business model.
That is so cool. I love that. And I think because so many of the brands that, are in the Brand Pollinators community and probably brands here today, really focused on that impact piece and the mission that brought them to creating the product that they're creating now. So yeah, it's really interesting. And it is hard to know how much weight people put on that mission, because consumers, there's all this research about how people say that they're really concerned, but then there's kind of conflicting evidence that they'll actually spend more on things that they say that they're concerned about. So yeah, having that really clear line, because I mean, I've never in my life thought of Hellmann's as like a saving, like fighting food waste kind of thing. But
I'm sure you're not alone, Kate. And
yeah.
It was a long journey for the brand. I saw this one from a distance.
Yeah.
Hellmann's actually started in New York delis. And so it was like this deli mayonnaise brand that made really delicious sandwiches. And so taste was always a thing for them. But then they found that like recipe solutions were actually a really good way to grow the brand. And so they found that it was this like flexible category development sort of growth story. And because of that, they started to find their way to sandwiches, and they found their way to leftovers. And then they thought, oh my God, food waste is this massive problem. About 30 to 40% of all food produced actually goes to waste. And so if adding Hellmann's to something in your fridge that would otherwise, go into the bin can actually make a positive impact in the world, let's do it. Let's latch our brand onto that, and let's really build that equity over time. So I think it's a beautiful mission. They're trying to get there. They're still early stage in it. So it still might feel a little conceptually far away for the folks on the phone. But I think it does make sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it feels like there could be a movement in that direction if they're doing it on purpose. But I think, yeah, Gage just hit the nail on the head. So they're jumping on that food waste movement, but it wasn't created for that purpose. And so it's like, it's a fine line, I think, with greenwashing, because it's like, oh yeah, we're saving food waste by like buying mayonnaise. But there's definitely something to it where it's a product that can extend the life of other foods. And so, it's not it's not doing what they say, but it wasn't created that way. And so it feels a little bit off to me.
Totally agree. I think it's always delicate to try to figure out, are they actually walking the walk, or are they just trying to get like a piece of this?
Yeah.
So I totally hear you, Gage. I think that's totally reasonable that you're pushing back there. Okay, sure. Why not a natural fit for Morton salt? Sure, that actually is a preservative. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they should totally get on board with that. I think bigger brands have a harder time of it, because they have to take an existing asset. They have to take an existing business. They have to take all the strange existing associations that people have with the brand, and they have to make it work. A lot of the folks on the phone right now have the luxury of starting from a totally clean slate. And I think that makes it possible to do something really, really cool that some big brands would really love to do, but they don't actually have the creative license or the cultural cachet to do it. So yeah, I would love to see more brands of all sizes trying to do more of this work in an authentic way where they walk the walk.
That's such a good point. I mean, there's like this level of bureaucracy and like this deep rooted brand awareness that has to kind of shift monumentally in order for us to perceive them as like an impact brand. And yeah, it's not going to happen right away, I'm sure. Somebody mentioned Tony Chocolonely, which is a great chocolate company. You know those guys, Nick? Do you know the
No,
guys?
that's new to me.
Oh my gosh, I feel like I have some in my cabinet. I could pull them out right now, but amazing chocolate brand, and they were created by somebody who's really concerned about witnessing child slavery in Africa. And so they built a really amazing brand, and their chocolate is phenomenal. Definitely check that out. They're actually like the way that they don't make the chocolate bar with like equal segments. It's like all these different shape segments because of like the inequities in the cocoa system and everything. It's very cool.
That's super cool that like the mission actually permeates the product, right?
Oh,
Like
it does.
you have a physical interactive experience with the problem that they're trying to solve. It's really cool. Yeah.
Yes,
I'll have
awesome.
to check it out.
Yeah, Tony's Chocolate. You can find them in Whole Foods and stuff. It's a very good chocolate too. Oh, okay. So we have another question. How do you prioritize product benefits versus product purpose? Customers will always want to know what's in it for them first.
Yeah, for sure. To me, they're the same thing, right? It ultimately comes down to benefits. Why are people buying the category? Why are they choosing a brand over another one? It could be a functional benefit. It could be an emotional benefit. And some categories are really dominated by people who want functional benefits, and some are really about emotional benefits. Typically, more premium brands have the license to play in more of this this purpose-driven space, and some of it just comes down to your P&L, right? Like if they're able to charge a premium price, there's more money to go around, and they can actually afford to fund social missions, but it's not always the case. And so one of the models that I'm actually wrestling with right now is that, to me, it's like sustainability kind of sits on one side, sustainability, purpose, like all of the positive attributes that we're talking about here, it kind of sits on one side, and then like affordability and accessibility sits on the other. So you can either have like these amazing high-minded ideas, or you can have like the down-to-earth brass tacks of what it takes to actually like choose a product. I think we're starting to see those blur, especially as you look to younger generations. Gen Z buys almost exclusively based on whether brands overlap with their values, compared to older generations, which may not be that way. I've seen a lot of different research reports that basically said millennials are all about purpose and sustainability until it impacts product functionality or until they have to pay a premium, and then they're out. But Gen Z is willing to completely put their money where their mouth is, and they might actually accept a product that's more expensive or that actually isn't performing quite as well functionally for something that overlaps with their values. So I think it's coming.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it seems to be like a generational thing, or the upcoming generations are definitely putting much more weight on those values and aligning when they're making purchases, which is really cool. I think it's really cool to see.
Yeah, one other thing that I have to say, like I feel like I wouldn't have been someone who worked underneath Paul Pullman at Unilever if I didn't say this, but there is no trade-off between purpose and profitability. There's none. Brands that are purpose-driven grow faster. They grow 2 to 3 times faster if you look at the Kantar data or the Deloitte data. B Corps, when they conducted the study, it was B Lab, they found that B Corps in the UK grew 28 times faster than non-B Corps. So there is no trade-off between purpose and profitability. And I will go to my grave believing this and trying to prove it. It's my entire business model, and I'm trying to help more purpose-driven brands.
I love that, and I think that is a great note to end on. We're at an hour now, and it's been a fabulous conversation. I know I enjoyed it. I hope you all did. Please reach out if you have any further questions. Nick, where's the best place for people to find you?
LinkedIn. Find me on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn, awesome. Look up Nick on LinkedIn. He's posting regularly on there, has some great content. And Gabe says, don't go to your grave yet.
I'll do my best.
Proven. Love
All
that.
right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. This was really fun.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And if you need more information from Nick, or if you're interested in joining in any of our future calls, please reach out to me. You can find us at brandpollinators.com. You can email me, kate@brandpollinators.com, or find me on LinkedIn as well. We love doing these conversations and making sure that we can answer questions for you. So let us know what's been helpful and what else we can do to help your brands. Cheers, everyone. Have a great day.